What would you do if an angel appeared in your sleep and told you to stay with the woman everyone else told you to leave? Welcome to Midnight Psalms, where the silence of night meets the whispers of heaven. Here, we explore sacred dreams, divine interruptions, and the hidden instructions God delivers when the world sleeps. He couldn't sleep, not the way men do when peace fills their house. Joseph lay still, his eyes open, staring into a darkness heavier than usual. He kept replaying Mary's words in his head. "I'm pregnant, but it's not what you think." Those words had shattered him, not with rage, but with heartbreak. He loved her, not just in word, but in the way a man dreams of building a quiet life with someone he trusts. Now that dream felt stolen, shattered by a mystery he couldn't explain to himself. Let alone the neighbors. How could he go on? How could he take her as wife when the entire village would call him a fool or worse, a liar? His heart beat slow and heavy like a hammer hitting wet stone. The room was silent, but the questions inside him shouted endlessly. He decided to end it quietly, not to shame her, just to protect what little dignity was left. He thought silence would be the kindest thing he had to give. But in the night, when the world dims and truth feels louder, heaven had something else to say. The dream didn't start with thunder or fire or shaking earth. It began with stillness, a stillness deeper than sleep, more awake than daylight. He was standing in a place he didn't recognize but somehow felt safe in. The sky above him shimmered, not with stars, but with presence, like the night was being held open by invisible hands. And there, a voice, not heard with ears but felt in the bones, called his name, Joseph, son of David. The words carried weight, like they knew his past and honored his bloodline, like he was being reminded of something ancient inside him. Then came the instruction, clear and uncompromising. Do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. The voice knew his thoughts, his fears, his struggle for honor and righteousness. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command soaked in compassion. And before Joseph could argue, the messenger continued, revealing what Mary could not. The child in her is from the Holy Spirit. That sentence cracked open something inside him. Not doubt, but awe. The child, from the Spirit? Joseph's logical mind stumbled, but his spirit stood still, listening. The voice wasn't trying to explain everything, just enough to change everything. It wasn't a call to understand, it was a call to obey, and that was Joseph's language, obedience. He had been taught to follow God not because he always understood him, but because trust isn't built on proof, it's built on presence, and this dream, this holy midnight interruption, was saturated with the presence of the Almighty. The voice continued, speaking of a name, "You shall call him Jesus," not a name chosen by family or tradition, but one heaven had picked centuries before, a name that meant salvation, a name for a child who would save his people from their sins. Joseph wasn't just being asked to stay, he was being invited into a plan far bigger than his heartbreak. The dream faded, but the stillness didn't. Joseph woke up not with confusion, but with clarity. The room was still dark, but something brighter had entered him, direction. He sat up, steady now, with the kind of certainty that doesn't come from logic but from encounter. The pain hadn't vanished, but it had been redefined. He understood now that Mary's story wasn't betrayal, it was a miracle in disguise. And the child inside her wasn't proof of scandal, but the fulfillment of prophecy. Joseph rose and walked to the door, opened it to the cool air, and let the wind pass through him like breath from heaven. He had received his instructions not from a rabbi, not from the law, not from his own thoughts, but from the God who speaks in dreams. And in that obedience, something shifted, not just in Joseph, but in history itself. He would go to Mary, not just to marry her, but to guard a miracle. He found her at dawn, sitting by the olive tree, eyes red from weeping. She didn't look surprised to see him, just braced, like she expected the final goodbye. But Joseph knelt, not to propose again, but to vow something deeper. He told her about the dream, about the angel, the message, the name. Her eyes filled, not just with tears, but with recognition. Someone else had finally seen what God had shown her, and in that moment, two hearts aligned not in romance first, but in reverence. They weren't just building a family, they were sheltering God's arrival. Joseph took her hand and they walked back, not as a couple hiding shame, but as carriers of a mystery no one else yet understood. Their future would be misunderstood, judged, and whispered about, but their path had been lit by divine instruction, and that was enough for Joseph to begin. The months that followed weren't easy. Everywhere they went, eyes followed, voices murmured, silence grew heavy. People who once admired Joseph's integrity now avoided his gaze, confused by his choices. But Joseph didn't flinch. Obedience had replaced opinion in his value system. Every night, he returned home not to sleep, but to listen, to the silence, to God, to the stillness that speaks louder than noise. Mary often rested her head beside his, and in the darkness they held not answers, but presence. They learned to trust the God who doesn't always explain, but always accompanies. Joseph, the dreamer now awakened, began to understand something deeper about fatherhood, that it begins not with biology, but with courage to protect what heaven births, and he was ready, not because he was strong, but because he was surrendered. And then the journey came, the decree, the travel, the search for shelter. Joseph led Mary through crowded streets and dusty hills, knocking on doors that all answered the same, no room. It felt like the world had closed itself to the greatest event it had ever unknowingly awaited. But Joseph didn't panic. Dreams had taught him not to measure the sacred by comfort. He found the stable, cleared the space, held Mary's hand as labor began. He was not just present, he was positioned, and when Jesus was born, wrapped in cloth and laid in a manger, Joseph watched with the quiet pride of a man who had obeyed without applause. He looked at the child, and in the dark stillness of that stable, whispered the name given to him by angels, Jesus. The dream had become flesh, and Joseph's yes had made a way. But the dreams didn't stop. Soon after the child's birth, another night brought another instruction. Danger was coming, Herod was searching, they had to flee to Egypt. Again, the message came not by messenger on foot, but in sleep. And again, Joseph rose not in fear, but in trust. He packed quietly, woke Mary, held Jesus close, and they vanished into the night guided by dreams that protected what the world didn't yet understand. Joseph had become more than a carpenter, he was now a guardian of divine purpose. He didn't lead with loud declarations, but with quiet obedience that moved heaven's plan forward. The road to Egypt was hard, but his heart was steady, shaped by nights of instruction and days of hidden faithfulness. Years passed like shadows moving across stone, slow and silent. Joseph raised Jesus with the reverence of a man who knew he was fathering someone who had fathered him first. Every board he carved, every nail he hammered, every lesson he taught by example was a form of worship. He never claimed credit, never sought stage or story, he just showed up, every day, faithfully present. His life became a song only heaven heard clearly, a melody of midnight trust and carpenter courage. And though Scripture records little of his words, his silence speaks volumes. It tells us that not every hero roars, some just listen and obey. Joseph's story reminds us that sometimes God's greatest instructions don't come when the sun is high, but when the world is asleep. In the hush of night, when fear is loudest and hope feels faint, heaven leans close with messages that change everything. Joseph teaches us that obedience isn't always loud, and faith isn't always public. Sometimes, the most powerful decisions happen in dreams, and the strongest men are those who say yes in the dark, long before the world sees the light. His life challenges us to trust not just what we can see, but what we've heard in the stillness. And maybe, just maybe, God is still speaking to the ones who dare to listen at midnight. If you are enjoying this video, please like, subscribe and hit the notification bell to help this channel reach more people. Now let's continue. The beauty of Joseph's obedience is that it wasn't dramatic, it was deliberate. He didn't need the validation of the crowd or the clarity of every detail to say yes to God. One dream, one divine whisper, was enough for him to adjust his entire future, and that's what separates faith from fantasy. Faith acts without guarantees, moves without applause, protects what others mock because it trusts the source of the message more than the logic of the moment. Joseph's role in the story of redemption wasn't built on miracles he performed but on the miracle he preserved, simply by staying when it would have been easier to leave. And in a world where men are often taught to walk away from confusion, Joseph stayed, quietly brave, because heaven had spoken and his soul had heard. There's something holy about the way God chose to speak to him, not through thundering clouds or burning bushes, but through sleep, the most vulnerable and defenseless human state. It's as if God was saying, Joseph, you don't need to strive to hear me, you just need to rest, and in that rest, heaven entered. How often do we miss divine instructions because we never slow down, never go still enough to dream, never believe that God still invades our nights with messages bigger than our fears? Joseph teaches us that the night isn't just for rest, it's for revelation. and that revelation can reshape a man's life, reroute his path, and make him the father of a child not born from him, but destined to save him. When they reached Egypt, far from the comfort of homeland and family, Joseph could have felt lost, but he didn't. He carried with him the clarity of the dream, and that made the foreign land feel sacred. He built a life there not out of fear, but out of calling. Every nail he drove into foreign wood, every brick he laid, was done with the quiet awareness that obedience had led him here, and that's the paradox of divine instruction. It often takes us where we didn't plan to go, but plants us exactly where we need to grow. Joseph didn't ask God for escape, he asked for guidance, and God gave it, one dream at a time. Eventually, another dream came. Herod was dead, it was time to return, and just like before, Joseph listened. Not because the journey made sense, not because it was convenient, but because he had learned to trust dreams as doorways into God's will. Returning wasn't a rewind, it was a restart. He took his small family back to Nazareth, a town that would never understand who was living among them, and quietly resumed his craft. The Son of God would grow in anonymity, and Joseph would be there. Every step, not as a headline, but as a foundation, silent, strong, surrendered. Nazareth didn't throw a parade when they returned. There was no celebration, no prophecy in the synagogue that welcomed them. But Joseph didn't need recognition, he needed only obedience. Day after day, he worked with his hands, and Jesus watched. In those quiet workshops, manhood was modeled not in words, but in presence. Jesus learned strength not from soldiers, but from a father who chose surrender. He learned stability not from kings, but from a man who followed whispers in the night. And isn't that how God works? Using the invisible to build the eternal? We don't read Joseph's prayers, but we feel them in his actions. We don't hear his sermons, but we see his theology in how he loved, how he stayed, how he obeyed. He didn't perform miracles, but he raised one. And that should speak to anyone who feels unseen, uncelebrated, unnoticed. God notices. God chooses the ones the world overlooks, the ones who respond in the quiet. The ones who say yes in their sleep and walk it out in the daylight. Joseph's silence wasn't emptiness, it was depth, and it tells us that sometimes the loudest faith is the one that simply keeps showing up. There's something deeply comforting in knowing that the first sounds Jesus heard on earth were not angel choirs or temple chants, but the heartbeat of a man who said yes in a dream. A man who breathed peace into a child cradled in uncertainty. Joseph's arms were the first cradle of the incarnate Word, and his obedience shaped the environment where God would grow in flesh. Joseph didn't just raise Jesus. He raised our expectations of what quiet faithfulness can do. This story isn't just about dreams, it's about direction, and not just direction for Joseph, but for us. When God speaks in the dark, it's not just to inform us, it's to form us, and Joseph allowed every divine whisper to reshape his character, his plans, his definition of manhood. We often want clarity before we obey, but Joseph obeyed before he had clarity, and that obedience brought clarity. He reminds us that trust isn't passive, it's a movement in the dark, a reach in the silence, a yes before the answers. If you've ever felt like your story is too quiet to matter, like your role is too small to count, remember Joseph. Heaven trusted him with its most precious plan, not because he was powerful, but because he was faithful. Your quiet yes might be protecting something sacred, even if no one else sees it. God still speaks in dreams, in nudges, in sleepless nights where obedience is harder than explanation, and when he does, may we have Joseph's heart, not to argue, but to follow, not to question, but to guard what's holy. Joseph's life is proof that some of God's greatest works are born in silence, carried in secret, and protected by those who don't need a stage. Maybe you've had nights like his, confused, afraid, unsure what to do next. But if you quiet your heart, you might hear him too, and when you do, trust the whisper, follow the dream, and walk in obedience, even if it's dark. Because some instructions only come at midnight, and those who listen become part of heaven's story. If this story stirred something in you, consider subscribing to Midnight Psalms, where night speaks and souls awaken.